We'll start off at the quarterback position with Justin Herbert. He looked great last week against Kansas City, scoring nearly 28 fantasy points, and I like him this week against the Raiders. He has owned this team in his career. In fact, Herbert has scored 18 plus points 8 times and has averaged nearly 23 points per game against the Raiders in his career, so keep him in your lineup. I also like Dak Prescott, and I get it. Last week, not great from a fantasy perspective, but I think he was better in terms of real football, and his stats suffered because CeeDee Lamb had the dropsies last week. I like him against the Giants, though. In his career, Dak is averaging nearly 21 fantasy points per game against them in 13 career meetings, so look for Dak Prescott to bounce back in this NFC East battle. The sit-em quarterbacks begin with CJ Stroud, and the matchup actually isn't bad this week against Tampa Bay, but look at his numbers. Over his last 18 games, Stroud has scored 16.1 or more fantasy points just 3 times. Houston's offensive line has question marks. Their backfield has question marks. I just can't start CJ Stroud outside of a super flex league, and the same goes for Sam Darnold because, well, last week in his first game, not in a Minnesota uniform in over a year, he did not look good. 150 yards, no touchdowns. Now he's got the Steelers on the road. In their last 8 home games, Pittsburgh has allowed an average of just 14.4 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. Sam Darnold shaky, maybe even in super flex leagues. Moving on to the running back position, and Travis Etienne, his value has risen exponentially since the trade that sent Tank Bigsby to Philadelphia. And last week, Etienne Jr. was the lead back for the Jaguars. I like the matchup this week against Cincinnati. They've allowed at least 15 fantasy points to running backs in 7 of their last 8 games, dating back to last season. I also like David Montgomery, and I get it. He did not have a good game last week, but no Lions really had a good game. But he does historically do well against his former team, the Bears. In fact, he's averaged nearly 15 points against them in 3 career meetings. Chicago has also allowed the 4th most points to running back since the start of last season, so David Montgomery should remain in your lineup. I'm going to say to beware Omarion Hampton. Now, the good news is that he saw almost all of the touches for the Chargers last week in their backfield. The bad news, he averaged 3.2 yards per carry and scored just 8.1 fantasy points. And while you may look at the matchup this week and think, well, it's the Raiders, their defense has actually allowed 1 running back to score more than 14.5 fantasy points against them since week 12 of last year. So this is not a great matchup for Omarion Hampton. I'm also going to sit DeAndre Swift against his old team, the Lions. And I get it, it's the revenge game narrative, but he just isn't a player that I trust. I get it, the volume is there. He had 54 snaps played in 20 touches last week, but Detroit has allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points to running back since the start of last season, and Swift is just not a reliable player. So if you have backfield depth, I would sit DeAndre Swift. Moving on to the wide receivers, in Hollywood Brown, I mean, he was certainly a star last week, the most targeted wide receiver in the entire league with 16 targets. Xavier Worthy is injured and won't play. The Eagles' pass defense did not look great against the Cowboys in the opener, and this game has a very high total at 47, so Hollywood Brown is a very good play this week as a flex. Sticking with that same game, how about Devontae Smith? Devontae and A.J. Brown both did nothing last week against the Cowboys, but I think they'll both put up very good numbers this week in what should be a high-scoring game. The Chiefs last week allowed more than 60 combined fantasy points to the Los Angeles Charger wide receivers, so this could end up being a bounce-back game, not only for Smith, but for A.J. Brown. Keep them both in your lineup despite last week's stinker. Wide receivers I'm sitting, and it's 2 players who went off last week, and first is Keon Coleman, and he was a favorite sleeper of mine coming into the season, and he had a huge game last week with over 25 fantasy points, but now he's got to face Sauce Gardner and the Jets. And when you look at the numbers dating back to last year, their defense has allowed just 15.4 fantasy points per game to perimeter receivers. It's not a great matchup for Coleman. Start him with caution. Same goes for Michael Pittman Jr., who also had a very good game last week, 20 fantasy points, but that was not against Patrick Surtain, and that's who he's going to have to face this week. This is a bad matchup. Looking at Denver's defense dating back to last year, they've given up an average of fewer than 90 yards per game to perimeter receivers, so keep Michael Pittman Jr. on the bench. Now let's go to the tight end position in Mark Andrews, a player who last week had a massive stinker, 1.5 fantasy points against Buffalo, but I like him this week against Cleveland. Historically, he's done very well against the Browns. In fact, he scored 14 plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games against this AFC North opponent, so keep the faith in Mark Andrews. And I also like Jake Ferguson against the Giants. Last week, he only scored 7.3 fantasy points, but he was targeted 6 times, and that's a good thing. The Giants last week gave up a touchdown to Zach Ertz, and they also have given up 24.5 points to Ferguson combined in their last 2 two meetings. So Ferguson is a player that I like this week. In terms of the sit-ems, well, I have Kyle Pitts Sr. on this list, but it comes with a caveat. And I get last week he had a very good game, but historically he does well against the Buccaneers. This week he faces the Minnesota Vikings, who have been very tough against tight ends dating back to last year. But if Drake London is out or limited, then Pitts becomes a better option. If London is a start, I am sitting Kyle Pitts. And then finally, Colson Loveland, who I told you not to play last week, and the numbers just were not there. In fact, Cole Kmet is still the #1 tight end in Chicago. Loveland was really restricted to only playing in 2 tight end sets. The targets weren't there, the snaps weren't there, so I would sit Colson Loveland until further notice.